Hi, I'm Hannah McLaughlin, a senior in the English program, and I will be presenting a snapshot of my senior thesis, The Angel of the House and the Fallen Woman, the Domination and Demonization of Women's Sexuality in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1897, taking place predominantly in Victorian England. The story's title character, Count Dracula, invades the minds and bodies of numerous English women, including the novel's main heroine Mina Harker and her best friend Lucy Westenra. Through the employment of feminist theory, I aim to prove that Bram Stoker's Dracula reflects the Victorian culture which reinforced men's sexual autonomy while punishing women's, through the lens of the virgin-whore dichotomy. Despite the novel's demonization of women's sexuality, it does provide hope for women's intellectual liberation. Count Dracula, a man of at least 300 years, serves as a striking representation of the perpetuity of patriarchy. He seeks to dominate women through both psychological manipulation and sexual assault. In her articles Sins of the Flesh, Anorexia, Eroticism, and Female Vampires in Bram Stoker's Dracula, scholar Emma Domingue-Roux supports the claim that, quote, vampires are defined by their monstrous appetite for human blood, obviously symbolizing erotic appetite, end quote. I also support this claim. A close reading of the text reveals that Dracula's vampiric thirst, or bloodlust, toward his female victims reflects traditional, if unchecked, lust. Stoker's parallel between vampirism and lust is established in the first act of the story. This parallel directly reflects the patriarchal cultural norms of Victorian England. Main character Jonathan Harker travels on business to Count Dracula's remote castle on the border of Transylvania. However, when he explores a chamber the Count had forbidden him from, he has a terrifying sexual encounter with three of Dracula's brides, vampire women who attempt to drink his blood before Dracula stops them. Through their sexually aggressive behavior, Stoker frames women's free, and especially dominant, sexuality as unthinkable evil. Stoker also uses the brides to indicate that voluptuousness is aligned with monstrosity in women. Emma Domingue-Roux addresses the expectations set on women's bodies in the Victorian era. Quote, male standards of femininity regarded women as angels of purity and innocence, and thus as physically weaker and necessarily less carnal than men, end quote. Dracula's wives are an affront to this conception of the Victorian woman, both through their voluptuousness, or the fullness of their forms, and through their carnal appetite for sex and blood. The patriarchal Victorian conception of female sexuality held that all women had a rampant and insatiable sex drive, which they were expected to repress, both through their careful conduct and in the minimization of their bodies, and thus their strength. The brides of Dracula are monstrosities because they devour, they have well-fed forms, and they physically dominate. They are the worst horror of the Victorian man, as Jonathan indicates in his repulsion toward them. However, the Count shares the unchecked hunger and sexual voracity of his wives. The distinction is that for hundreds of years he's largely been permitted or able to indulge it. His disregard for female sexual autonomy is revealed in his repeated vampiric attacks. These attacks are typically covert and are rarely directly depicted in the story. He's a stalker outside main character Lucy and Mina's bedroom windows. He takes various forms, a bat, a wolf, but is a man when he creeps into their bedrooms, where they lie unclothed and sucks the blood from their throats. However, while Dracula has gotten away with this behavior for hundreds of years, the consequences of these attacks for the female victims are determined by their positioning within the virgin-whore dichotomy. The virgin-whore dichotomy of female sexuality is primarily examined in feminist criticism. The Victorian equivalents to the virgin and whore were the angel in the house and the fallen woman. In her article, Staking Salvation, the Reclamation of the Monstrous Female in Dracula, Jennifer Swartz-Levine reveals some cultural context behind this in saying that, quote, early English conduct books construct a parallel between immodesty and insanity, for as one manual intoned, An impudent woman is looked on as a kind of monster, a thing diverted and distorted from its proper form. End quote. Analyzing Bram Stoker's Dracula through this dichotomy reveals that main character Mina Harker represents the angel of the house, a Victorian ideal, while her friend Lucy Westenra represents the fallen woman or Victorian monster. The patriarchal distinctions between Mina and Lucy swiftly determine their fates. Lucy is quickly punished for being a fallen woman, while Mina is saved for fighting to maintain her virginity. In contrast, Count Dracula's punishment for his own sexual transgressions is delayed by 3 centuries. Those transgressions are essential to the understanding of how the Count perpetuates violent forms of patriarchy which dominate female sexuality. The urge for sexual dominance which lies behind Dracula's attacks is exposed in a climactic rape scene where he forcibly drinks Mina's blood while her husband sleeps beside her. Mina recalls the Count's demands. Quote, "Silence! If you make a sound, I shall dash his brains out before your very eyes." With a mocking smile, he placed one hand upon my shoulder and, holding me tight, bared my throat with the other, saying as he did so, "First, a little refreshment to reward my exertions. You may as well be quiet. It is not the first time, or the second, that your veins have appeased my thirst." End quote. This passage exposes the correlation between Dracula's thirst for blood and his thirst for sexual power. It also reveals how the Count both psychologically and physically controls Mina in order to violate her, while telling the reader that he has violated her unconscious body many times before. Despite that Mina is already a married woman, the Count claims her as his own in a savage and forceful act of molestation. Her horrified reaction to these events makes it clear that Dracula has no respect for the autonomy of his victims, sexually or otherwise. Mina is so repulsed by this that she cries out to God for aid. This faithfulness reinforces her role as the virgin, but what especially defends that role is how she reacts to the attack while it's happening. Jennifer Swartz-Levine astutely knows that Mina, quote, tries to preserve her chastity and rages ineffectually against him, even as he forces her to drink her own destruction, end quote. The Count is proven to be a rapist in that he only assaults women, attacks them in their bedchambers, prefers unconscious victims, undresses for the act, and penetrates them with his fangs. He also not only consumes their bodily fluids, but makes them drink his own. He uses physical force, threats, and hypnosis to remove the option of consent for Mina, Lucy, and his other victims. The fact that he repeatedly drinks blood from the unconscious and half-naked Lucy and Mina exposes him as a serial rapist. Dracula displays a violent misogyny toward women by pursuing only them as his permanent victims, or lifelong partners. Through the possession of many wives and the active pursuit of others, the Count serves as an extreme example of male domination and sexual liberty through promiscuity and polygamy. His sexual liberty starkly contrasts the repressed sexuality and monogamous ideals of main character Mina, the angel of the house, who survives the story. However, when Mina's friend Lucy, a fallen woman, unconsciously achieves her own polygamy by receiving blood transfusions from multiple men, she is punished by death. This fact underscores the demonization of Victorian women's sexual liberty, as well as the relevance of the virgin-whore dichotomy in Victorian culture. When Lucy is unknowingly being victimized by Dracula, she receives blood transfusions from all her past suitors, as well as her fiancé Arthur. Jonathan Harker speaks to Van Helsing about this affair. Quote, "Said Arthur not that the transfusion of his blood to her veins had made her truly his bride?" End quote. Van Helsing replies, "Quite so. But if so that, then what about the others? Ho ho, then this so sweet maid is a polyandrist." End quote. Through this comment, Van Helsing indicates that Lucy became a polyandrist by receiving their fluids, polyandrist being a term that only applies to women. Through this dialogue, Stoker reflects the patriarchal norms which dictated women's sexuality in Victorian England. Lucy has become a fallen woman. Lucy dies despite the transfusions. She is narratively killed off because of her sexual promiscuity. However, she rises again to become a sexually voracious, voluptuous, and non maternal vampire abomination, feeding on young children, who is staked to death or correctively penetrated by her former fiance. Though in life she spoke of polygamy and unconsciously participated in it, as a vampire she became the true monster of the Victorian man's conception, and as the whore or fallen woman, Lucy is punished to the highest degree, being staked and having her head chopped off. Mina also becomes a victim of Dracula and receives blood transfusions from men later in the story. This may lead one to question her monogamy. However, the distinction between her and Lucy is that she is married at the time and has never wished for or spoken in favor of polygamy. In fact, she's repulsed by it. Mina aligns neatly with the Victorian concept of the angel of the house in that she is pure and virtuous, a chaste paragon of morality. She's content with monogamy and the cultural expectation that she'll serve her husband. It's also arguable that because Jonathan's illness, Dracula-related, because of Jonathan's Dracula-related illness following their wedding, she remains a virgin until the epilogue. These traits set her up as the virgin of the virgin-whore dichotomy, or the angel of the house to Lucy's fallen women. In a letter to Lucy, Mina writes, "I want you to see now, and with the eyes of a very happy wife, whither duty has led me," and she goes on. In this, she refers to enjoying executing the duty of a wife to her husband. She makes a similar comment later in the story when Lucy lies ill in her bed with Dr. Seward attending to her. Mina says to him, "We owe you so much, Dr. Seward, for all you have done, but you really must now take care not to overwork yourself. You want a wife to nurse and look after you a bit." As she says this, Lucy turns crimson. This scene is representative of Mina's deep respect for a wife's traditional self-sacrificing, nurturing role in a marriage, alongside Lucy's anxieties around it. Lucy had refused Dr. Seward's hand, and instead of serving as a wife, nursing and looking after him, he filled that role for her. Lucy's discomfort with the expectations of marriage and rejection of the feminine role of caretaker rendered her a fallen woman and led to her narrative demise. Mina's continued commitment to the role of a wife and to monogamy shields her from that punishment. While the virgin-whore dichotomy reflects the patriarchal stereotypes of Victorian England, it can be argued that Mina's breaking away from these stereotypes through scientific thought liberates her from the two-dimensional characterization of the virgin and renders her a progressive feminist character. Mina serves as the stenographer of her vampire fighting band, recording, in shorthand, their observations of vampiric phenomena. These serve as scientific recordings, noting biological differences between humans and vampires. Though Dr. Seward reflects on this in his own recordings, Mina writes about the party's observations of an increasingly animalistic prisoner, the Count's thrall, and their experimental deductions drawn from hypotheses regarding his behavior. In her personal journal, she reflects on the advantage of science. Quote, "Well, you know what we have to contend against, but we too are not without strength. We have on our side a power denied to vampire kind. We have sources of science," end quote. Mina Harker, the only female member of the squad which eventually hunts Dracula, provides a foil for the control Dracula asserts over women. She is the first woman he attacks who gets her revenge. Additionally, on a larger scale, Mina opposes the patriarchal social order of Victorian society by engaging in masculine pursuits like science and monster hunting. It's repeatedly noted that her mind is sharp, like a man's. Thus, her manliness may blur the lines of the patriarchal standards placed on her. Van Helsing speaks to this effect when he says, quote, "Ah, that wonderful Madame Mina. She has a man's brain, a brain that a man should have were he much gifted," end quote. As noted earlier, Dracula does manage to hypnotize and assault Mina, as he does other women. However, she rises from this stronger and more resistant to the patriarchal expectations of her sex. Mina, quote, "operates within the patriarchy until intimacy with a monster creates a catalyst for her growing resistance," end quote. Mina is the only woman Count Dracula has encountered who is not only able to, but permitted to punish him for his molestations. The recognition and legitimization of Mina's sexual assault by the men around her was extremely uncommon in her society. However, it's important to note that to the men around her, Mina's role as an angel of the house or protected virgin arguably makes her worth giving concessions to. Her placement in an extremely gendered dichotomy affects her treatment. This reveals how limited Mina's liberation truly is. She's allowed academic or intellectual freedom, but not sexual freedom. For her time, this still makes her a rather feminist character. While Mina takes on the traditional role of wife, she's also a well-educated schoolteacher who's invited into a boys' club. The men around Mina do make efforts to keep her from physical harm, which plays into gendered stereotypes around male strength and female fragility. However, in the end, she goes with them to Dracula's castle and confronts the resident monsters, who are killed by her compatriots. Mina is set apart from other women of her time not only through her uniquely permitted autonomy, but through the fact that she possesses the scientific mind stereotypically associated with men. Mina's ability to employ both the stereotypically nurturing qualities of womanhood and the stereotypically logical qualities of manhood is what distinguishes her as a feminist character. She cannot be defined along strictly gendered lines and subverts Victorian gender norms. Bram Stoker's Dracula depicts a count who dominates women over hundreds of years by penetrating them with his fangs and forcing them to drink his fluid. He is a misogynistic character who participates in non-consensual polygamy or serial rape, converting women into his wives by claiming their bodies and spirits while they are unconscious. However, when the unmarried Lucy consciously celebrates and unconsciously participates in this polygamy, she dies by Dracula's hand within days, and is later killed again. In this, Bram Stoker's Dracula reflects a patriarchal double standard which permits men's sexual autonomy while punishing women's. However, Stoker liberates the married angel of the house, Mina, from the limitations of the virgin-whore dichotomy, propelling her forward as a feminist character through her masculine scientific thinking and involvement in the hunt for a monster.